Mr. Chairman, I rise today to speak on behalf of my amendment to H.R. 1540. The underlying text of the National Defense Authorization Act calls for the shift of certain inherently governmental functions currently being performed by contractors to civilian employees within the Department of Defense. My amendment is simple. It requires that any cost savings achieved by this transfer be used for deficit reduction. Let me say that again. Any cost savings associated with shifting work from contractors to civilian employees will get used for deficit reduction. Reaching the debt limit last week was a stark reminder of the consequences of ballooning spending throughout the federal government, including defense spending. Committing cost savings to deficit reduction is the first step toward returning to a fiscally sustainable budget. By reducing the deficit with identified savings from the Department of Defense, we will help to ensure that we have enough to invest in education, infrastructure, and job-creating priorities that we all share, while cutting spending to reduce the deficit. This is a smart, fiscally responsible amendment, and I urge my colleagues to adopt it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank the gentleman for bringing this amendment. I know he's sincere in talking about deficit reduction, and I certainly appreciate that. All of us on this side are equally sincere. In fact, I'm one of only 17 members of this body who voted against every single one of the bailout and stimulus bills because we realized what it was doing to the deficit in this country. Secondly, I share the gentleman's concern when he talks about some of DOD's decisions to change from private contractors to civilians because some of those decisions haven't been based on business models, but just because they have not all been correct doesn't mean they have all been wrong. And the problem with this approach is it's exactly the wrong approach because it will be a disincentive to the Department of Defense to try to reach these efficiencies. The reason that DOD has an incentive to try to make these efficiencies is so that they can reprioritize and use these dollars for programs that are absolutely vital and important for the national defense of the country. To say that every time they make those savings, we're going to take off of the top line of the Department of Defense will be a disincentive for the Department of Defense to make those savings. And here's the effects that we have. If we don't have if we don't have civilians doing these jobs, we have had testimony coming before our committee from our generals and our admirals that basically what that means is they have to take military personnel to do that work, which means they don't have the time to do the training that they need to do to be prepared to fight and defend this country. The other concern we have with some of the reductions that we would be taking out of DOD, in the budget submitted to us this year, they were actually pushing back on facility maintenance that we needed to keep our facilities updated to only 80% of the maintenance that was required. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it's vitally important that we do a lot for deficit reduction. I think it's vitally important that we look at the fact, for example, on some of our stimulus bills, we're talking about $800 billion, and this we're talking about several $1 million. But I think the most important thing, Mr. Chairman, is that we make sure we're giving DOD the incentives they need to make sure they're prioritizing correctly the dollars that they have, and we not be taking money off of the top line of the defense budget, which I think would be detrimental to us at this time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I hope we'll oppose the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Chairman, if I understand the argument of my colleague from Virginia, he is saying that by taking away money for the purposes of debt reduction from the DOD, that they will be disincentivizing, that we will be disincentivizing action, which we all know to be the right thing to do here. So let me just toss out a couple of facts. Fact number one, Admiral Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has identified the debt of this country as perhaps the single largest strategic threat to the security of the country. Fact number two, in DOD we are talking about people who, if anywhere in the government, are dedicated to doing the right thing by all of us, sacrificing for the good of this nation. And their leader said that the single largest strategic threat to this country is our debt, how can you make an argument against this amendment? Think about the words of Admiral Mullen. The argument seems to me to be an insider Washington argument, which is if you take away cheese, they're going to be angry. They won't do the right thing because you're taking away their cheese. I'll stop speaking, but I'll just ask my colleague from Virginia whether he believes in the context of what Admiral Mullen said about deficit reduction in the debt, whether he really believes that the DOD will do the wrong thing here, and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia has
Thank you,
2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and I'd be glad to answer my good friend's question by saying I absolutely believe what Admiral Mullen said. When you look at the efficiencies that the Department of Defense has been talking about, we're talking about roughly $179 million. But I would suggest, my friend, look at comparing that to the $800 billion that we spent on a stimulus package, which I voted against because I realized what it was doing to the deficit in this country, exactly what the Admiral mentioned. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, that I would suggest to the gentleman is, quite honestly, I will tell him I do not know if the Constitution mandates or gives us the authority to bail out the auto industry or the insurance industry or the banking industry or the mortgage industry or whatever else we've been bailing out. But one thing I do know is this. When some of the smartest people this nation has ever birthed came together and agreed on one thing in our Constitution, the thing they mandated that this Congress do is to maintain strong armies and navies and to defend this country. And one of the things I unabashedly will say is that we need to stand firm and make sure the Department of Defense has the dollars that they need to defend and protect freedom and to pass it on to our children and our grandchildren. And I believe this amendment goes a step towards taking that ability away from them. With that, Mr. Chairman, I hope we'll reject the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Connecticut has 2¼ minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All I've got to say about that is wow. Here we are talking about the DOD and what we should do with savings found in the DOD, and the gentleman from Virginia is bringing up STIM and TARP and $800 billion, which have absolutely nothing to do with the question at hand, a mechanism that is used all too often by the other side. The gentleman mentions the Constitution. Nobody in this room is saying that we shouldn't adequately fund the Department of Defense. That's not what this is about, any more than this is about TARP or stimulus or any of the other things that my colleague spoke about. The Constitution also says that it is this body that will determine how funds are spent. My colleague from Virginia is saying that extra money at the DOD that are saved in a mechanism that we all agree makes sense, that it should be a slush fund, if you will, that the DOD should decide how they use that. The Constitution of the United States is very clear. That's our job. Nobody is saying that we should underfund defense. That's not what this is about. And I'm delighted that the gentleman takes such great pride in having voted against the stimulus and the TARP, which, by the way, I would say the day after that Chrysler has repaid its government loans 6 years early, the gentleman might revisit his point on that. But that's not what this is about. This is about good government and deficit reduction and abiding by the spirit of the Constitution that says we decide how money is used, not the agencies. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.